Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Hungary's new government is pressing ahead with ambitious program of institutional reform. After securing EU approval for its revised recovery plan, it is moving to unblock billions of euros in conditional funding while introducing anti-corruption measures, constitutional changes, and reforms to public media. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss what this means for Hungary's democratic transition is Orsolya Ráczová, analyst at Eurasia Group. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me.
Now, just within a few days, we saw Hungary secure EU approval for its recovery plan, also unveiled new anti-corruption measures, as well as proposed new constitutional reforms as well. Should these be seen as kind of separate initiatives, or is this one coordinated strategy to reshape the state?
I would say that this is one coordinated strategy, and this is basically a list of election promises that Peter Magyar has consistently been repeating during the campaign, but even after the campaign, after the election. So this is part of this kind of bigger strategy of, reforming, cleaning up the entire public sector from the 16 years of Fidesz rule. And part of it is changing some procedures, changing some basic laws, and also, of course, removing people who are seen as Fidesz loyalists. But I would add to this that, of course, some of these measures are also related to unlocking EU funds. And I'm not necessarily just talking about the Recovery and Resilience Fund, which has an end of August deadline, but of course a longer-term access to EU funds to show that Hungary's rule of law issues are and should no longer be a case or something to be worried about in Brussels. So I think this is a first step towards that as well.
Right, and speaking of that recovery and resilience funding, which, like I mentioned, the deadline for reform is relatively close. We're talking about end of August. At this point, do you think that the access to the around 10 billion euro remain, which just still remain conditionally with the implementation of reform? Is there any potential hurdles or something that could delay or block these funds?
Yes, the deadline is extremely close. As you said, end of August. We always knew that this is going to be a very tight deadline, but I think that the government is on a good trajectory to unlocking these funds. The parliament is going to be in session throughout the summer, and these are extraordinary sessions because, as we know, most parliaments are not in session during summer. But to unlock these funds, this is basically crucial because the government still needs to adapt new legislation to unlock this funding. I think the first step was that the government put together a new national plan that is now approved by the EU. So now they can move on and fulfilling the criteria and implementing this plan. What we are talking about is the milestones, of course, that the government needs to meet by end of August. But there is another and even bigger question is the absorption capacity. The fact that these resilience and recovery funds, the 10 billion that we are talking about, needs to be spent by the end of the year. So that essentially means that the government needs to adopt legislation that prepares projects that can be realized by the end of the year. And I think this is one of the biggest hurdles, that it's not that easy to spend this amount of money on specific projects where you basically have to start from scratch.
All right, isn't it a little bit kind of pressing, though, with all these deadlines in place and the funding to also, like I mentioned, to absorb with the capacity to utilize these funding? Do you think that the government will be able to scramble together to create any sort of comprehensive project that makes sure that these funds are being utilized properly, but not kind of go to waste just because they have to spend it for the sake of spending it?
Yes, I'm quite optimistic on that. I do think that the government will succeed. Whether the government will succeed with all 10 billions, that's still a question. But I think the government will be able to spend most, if not all of this money. What I have seen, the kind of projects that they are planning to spend this money on, including, for example, infrastructure projects, which are already very well prepared. You know, Hungary has a very capable new Minister of Transportation. So there I'm quite optimistic. When it comes to the energy issues, there I'm quite optimistic as well as healthcare and SME support. So I do think that they managed to put together a good list of projects that I think they will very likely be able to realize. Some of these projects were already prepared, of course. There were projects that could have been used to unlocking other EU funds. There you already have the project set up in a way that fulfills the criteria for unlocking EU funds. This is, by the way, one of the issues, right? That these projects need to satisfy quite serious and strict criteria on EU legislation on how you're spending public EU money. And if you're using projects that were prepared previously, or at least partially prepared, keeping this in mind, I think you're on a good trajectory to succeed. So I'm quite optimistic.
All right, now going back to Hungary's internal reform, there's a lot on the agenda here. We saw anti-corruption being central to the government agenda, with new oversight bodies being established, and as well as, like you mentioned earlier, to try to get rid of some of Fidesz's loyalists that's still remaining in the government. Now, taken separately, these sounds like a very good direction for reform, but looking at it together, is there any dangers that these oversight body will become difficult to be independent, and these institutions could fall into the tendency to become more politically influenced watchdogs?
Yes, of course, one of the issues is we know that what Péter Magyar is essentially doing is fulfilling his election promises, and the number one item, I think, on the agenda has been the anti-corruption agenda, and this is part of it. So I don't think that he is doing anything surprising or anything he hasn't promised. Of course, the issue, among other things, that some of the critics are using, that he is using his supermajority in parliament to pass legislation through very, very quickly. This is, of course, what Fidesz was doing as well. When you have a supermajority in parliament, you're using it. And the fact is, I think that the people of Hungary elected the TISA government with supermajority. So I think this is an expectation from the voters as well, that the government is using this supermajority. But of course, what this means is that when you're doing such deep changes and you're passing the legislation very quickly, then often the kind of public consultation that should be part of making such changes is either not there, or it's just very short and not deep and extended or inclusive enough. So I think that's one of the issues with some of the new nominations as well, when it comes to many public bodies, for example, the media. The media itself is a big question, of course, what's happening there, but also the Constitutional Court, the oversight body, as you said, and of course the president. The question around the president is a huge issue. So I think, yeah, I knew that you were going to ask about it. I will touch upon that. I think when Péter Magyar is appointing people temporarily to key positions, and that happened a couple of times, and that's done very quickly, I don't see any issues with that. When he's doing the same thing with permanent positions, of course, that's a bit more problematic. But the issue is that even if he appoints new people, these people, it doesn't mean that they will be cemented in these positions. So I think that even if you see new people in positions, it doesn't mean that they will stay there forever. So, and I do think that these changes are necessary. I don't think that this is bordering abusing your power too much. I don't think this is an issue. I think he needs to make deep systemic changes, and he needs to make them quickly, because this is part of the rule of law proceedings as well. Of course, the issues around the president are quite big, because the president is supposedly independent and should be above the government and the parliament. But what Péter Magyar has been saying is not untrue, that the president hasn't spoken up on key issues. For example, the child abuse cases, the Beneš decrees issue that was brought up many times. He hasn't spoken out on any of these things, and that's why his impartiality is being seriously questioned. But of course, it's quite a huge issue to try to get the president removed.
All right, last but not least, we have a little bit of time, and I want to get your opinion on that, because in President Zelenskyy's most recent social media post, he talked about fundamentally reconsidering or reworking relationship with neighboring allies, especially mentioning Hungary and Poland as well. Now, on the Hungary front, where do you see the Ukrainian-Hungarian relationship going from here?
I think that we have already seen improvements in the relationship, the bilateral relationship between Hungary and Ukraine. And the first point was when Hungary, or the first step was when Magyar removed the veto from unlocking EU funds. But the even more important behind this is that Péter Magyar has managed to negotiate with Zelenskyy about ensuring minority right protection in Ukraine, which is, of course, it's about the Hungarian minority for Péter Magyar, but of course it's a much bigger question. So there, I think we already saw some dialogue, we saw some legislative changes, so this is much bigger and more than anything else. There was barely any dialogue during Viktor Orbán in the past couple of years between Hungary and Ukraine. So I think just to have a constructive dialogue is already a big change. Legislative changes is a whole other issue. And what I expect, or where I see this going, is that Hungary will remain, of course, cautiously skeptical about, of course, some support to Ukraine, even enlargement. We know that Péter Magyar is taking a very pragmatic stance, but I think what's going to happen is that they will continue to have potentially mutually beneficial dialogue, and that's already a big improvement.
Right, so a lot of changes in a very short span of time for Hungary. We'll have to see how this goes. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you for having me. Have a good day.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.